The entire manor held its breath the night. Duke Caspian Thorne returned from the border with blood soaking through his coat and eyes that refused to meet anyone's gaze. He waved away the physician, dismissed his steward, and locked himself inside the east wing with orders that no one, absolutely no one, was to enter. For 3 days, the household tiptoed through corridors while their master slowly bled behind closed doors, choosing silence over healing, isolation over help, until a maid no one had bothered to learn the name of began singing outside his door at dawn, her voice carrying a melody so achingly familiar it shattered every wall he had built. And when the lock finally turned and the door opened, what the Duke found on the other side changed everything he thought he understood about survival, trust, and the strange mercy of being seen by someone the world had taught to remain invisible. 6 weeks earlier, Isla Fenn had arrived at Thornwood Hall carrying a single trunk and a reference letter, so modest it barely merited reading. She was hired without ceremony to assist in the lower household, laundering linens, polishing silver, tasks that required competence but not conversation. The steward had looked at her exactly once, noted her quiet manner and steady hands, and assigned her to quarters in the furthest wing. She understood immediately what was expected. Be useful. Be unseen. Ask nothing. Thornwood Hall was not unkind, merely indifferent. The staff operated with clockwork efficiency under the distant rule of Duke Caspian Thorne, a man whose reputation preceded him like winter fog. He was young for a duke, barely 30, but commanded his estate and his regiment with equal precision. He rarely entertained. He never raised his voice. When he walked through rooms, servants stepped aside not from fear, but from instinct, the way one makes space for weather. Isla learned his rhythms without ever speaking to him. He rose before dawn. He took meals in his study. He walked the grounds at dusk, always alone, hands clasped behind his back as though holding something heavy no one else could see. She learned other things, too. That he had served in 3 border campaigns. That his parents had died in a fire when he was 17, leaving him a title and a grief he never mentioned. But the household respected him absolutely and understood him not at all. Isla did not expect to be noticed. She had survived most of her life by being forgettable, moving through positions in great houses where competence mattered more than connection. She knew how to fold herself into corners, how to finish work before anyone realized it needed doing. But Thornwood Hall had a music room. She discovered it by accident one afternoon while carrying linens through an unused corridor. The door stood ajar, revealing dusty pianoforte, a harp beneath canvas, shelves of untouched songbooks. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating particles of stillness. Isla paused only a moment. Then she continued walking. But the room stayed with her. And 3 evenings later, when the household had retired and silence pressed against every surface, she returned. She did not play the pianoforte. Her hands had no training for that. But she knew songs. Ones her mother had sung before illness took her. Ones she had learned in the valley where she grew up, where music was not performance, but comfort, woven into work and grief and the ordinary ache of living. She sang quietly, just for herself. A lullaby about sparrows returning home. A ballad about a soldier who wandered too far from firelight. She did not hear the footsteps in the corridor. When she turned, Duke Thorne stood in the doorway. Not angry, not even surprised. Just watching with an expression she could not read. Isla's voice died instantly. She stood, heart hammering. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I didn't mean, what was that?" His voice was low, careful. "A song. I shouldn't have." "The second one," he interrupted. "Where did you learn it?" She hesitated. "My mother used to sing it. It's from the northern valleys." Something shifted in his face. Not softening exactly, more like recognition. "My mother knew that song," he said quietly. The silence that followed felt fragile. Then the Duke stepped back. "The room isn't used. You may come here, if you wish. Evenings only." Before Isla could respond, he was gone. She stood alone in the music room, aware that something had just changed, though she could not yet name what. After that night, she returned often. Never when anyone might notice. Never for long. Just enough to sing softly into the stillness, filling spaces that had been empty too long. She never saw the Duke again during those visits. But sometimes, passing through corridors afterward, she caught the faint scent of pipe smoke lingering near doorways. As though someone had stood just out of sight, listening. Then came the morning the messenger arrived from the border, his horse lathered and trembling. The Duke's regiment had engaged in a skirmish. Casualties were few, but the Duke himself had taken a wound and was returning immediately. The household mobilized with silent efficiency. The physician was summoned. Rooms were prepared. Everything made ready. Except no one expected what followed. When the Duke's carriage finally clattered into the courtyard near midnight, he emerged alone, refusing assistance despite the blood darkening his sleeve and collar. He walked past the physician without a word, past his steward's protests, straight into the east wing. The door locked behind him with a sound like finality. By the second morning, the household had begun to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. The physician paced outside the east wing, clutching his leather bag with increasing agitation. The steward stationed himself near the Duke's door, knocking at intervals with updates no one answered. Even the housekeeper, unflappable in all circumstances, had begun wringing her hands during morning briefings. "He hasn't eaten," she reported quietly. "He refuses entry to everyone. The wound." She stopped, unable to finish. Isla listened from her position near the servants' entrance, polishing silver that didn't need polishing. Around her, the other maids whispered theories. "Shell shock," some suggested. "Pride," said others. "Grief," wearing a different face. But Isla thought of the man who had stood in the music room doorway, who had recognized a song from childhood, whose mother had died in fire and smoke. And she wondered if maybe the Duke had simply reached the limits of what performance could sustain. That afternoon, she found the steward in the hallway outside the east wing, slumped against the wall in exhausted defeat. "He won't answer," the steward said hoarsely. "Not the physician, not me. I don't know what else." He looked up at Isla with desperate eyes. "Can you try?" She blinked. I don't care. No one else has gotten through. Please." Isla approached the door slowly. Her hand hovered over the dark wood. Then, instead of knocking, she began to sing. Quietly at first, the lullaby about sparrows finding their way home. Her voice thin in the vast corridor but steady, carrying the melody her mother had sung during storms when fear made sleep impossible. Behind her, the steward stared. Isla continued. The ballad about the soldier who wandered from firelight. Another about a sailor steering by stars. Psalms about returning, about stillness after chaos, about the ordinary mercy of rest. She did not know how long she sang. Long enough that her throat grew dry. Long enough that shadows shifted across floorboards. Then the lock turned. The door opened 6 inches. Duke Caspian Thorne stood in the gap, and Isla barely recognized him. His shirt was stained with old blood. His face looked carved from exhaustion. But his eyes, those careful, guarded eyes, held something she had never seen before. "Surrender. Come in," he said hoarsely. "Only you." The steward started forward immediately, but the Duke raised one hand. "I said only her." Isla stepped through the doorway. It closed behind her with quiet finality. The room was dark despite the afternoon sun. Curtains drawn. A single lamp burning low. The Duke moved carefully to a chair and sat as though his bones might shatter. "You know those songs," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, Your Grace. My mother sang them." His voice cracked slightly. "Before the fire." I hadn't heard the man. He stopped, jaw tightening. 13 years. Isla waited, hands folded. "They pulled me from the burning house," he continued, each word deliberate. "I was 17. They pulled me out, and I could hear her screaming inside, and I tried." He broke off, breathing hard. "I tried to go back in. They held me down, held me there while she—" He looked at Isla then, and his expression was so raw it hurt to witness. "At the border," he said quietly, "we were ambushed. There was fire, cannon fire, but still, the smoke, the screaming. One of my men was trapped. I pulled him out, but I heard—" His hands were shaking now. "I heard my mother screaming again, just like that night. And I couldn't." His voice failed completely. Isla understood then. Not just the wound everyone could see, but the one no physician could treat. The one that had been bleeding for 13 years, hidden beneath duty and competence and control, until fire and smoke tore it open again. Slowly, carefully, she crossed the room. She knelt beside his chair, not touching, just close enough that he would not be alone in the terrible space his confession had opened. "You saved him," she said quietly. "Your soldier. But I heard her die again." "You heard memory," Isla corrected gently. Memory can't hurt anyone new. It just hurts you. The Duke's breath hitched. For a moment, Isla thought he might ask her to leave. Instead, he did something that shattered her completely. He began to cry. Not loudly, almost silently. Shoulders shaking with the force of 13 years finally breaking through walls built from survival and shame and the terrible belief that grief should be borne alone. Isla stayed exactly where she was. She did not offer platitudes, did not look away, just remained, steady and present, while the Duke of Thornwood Hall finally allowed himself to be something other than composed. When he could speak again, his voice was wrecked. The wound isn't deep. I know it needs cleaning. I just couldn't let anyone see. I understand, Isla said. Do you? She met his gaze. My mother died slowly. Illness. I was 14. Everyone said I was so brave, so strong. But I wasn't. I was just afraid that if I stopped holding everything together, I'd disappear completely. Understanding moved between them like a current. Will you help me? The Duke asked quietly. Yes. The physician was summoned, but only after Isla cleaned the wound herself. Carefully, methodically, while the Duke sat rigid with something that was no longer just physical pain. When the doctor finally entered, he found his patient conscious, coherent, and accompanied by a maid who answered his questions with calm precision. The wound is shallow, the physician confirmed, applying fresh bandaging. Another day untended might have invited fever, but he'll recover fully. He glanced at Isla with poorly concealed curiosity. You have steady hands. My mother taught me, Isla said simply. After the physician departed, the Duke remained in the chair, staring at nothing. Isla moved to leave, but his voice stopped her. Stay? Please. She turned back. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. How to be? He gestured vaguely at himself. Less than composed. People expect walls, Isla finished. They expect walls. Yes. Then maybe, she suggested carefully, you could practice being without them. Just here. Just for now. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite hope, but perhaps the space where hope could eventually grow. Over the following days, the Duke began to heal. Not just the wound, though that closed cleanly, but something deeper, something that required more than bandages. Isla came to the East Wing each evening, always at his request, never presuming. Sometimes she sang. Sometimes she simply sat while he worked through correspondence, her presence providing an anchor he had not realized he needed. Sometimes they talked, about her childhood in the valleys, about his memories before the fire, about the strangeness of carrying grief that had no proper place to rest. The household noticed, naturally. Servants whispered. The steward frowned. The housekeeper watched with calculating eyes. But the Duke, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, did not adjust his behavior to accommodate others' comfort. When a visiting cousin made a pointed remark about the unusual attachment between master and maid, the Duke's response was ice. Miss Fenn has shown more wisdom and courage than anyone in this house. If that troubles you, the door remains open. The cousin did not raise the subject again. 6 weeks after the Duke's return, Isla was summoned to his study. She entered to find him standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose. But when he turned, his expression was different, open in a way that still seemed new. I'm told, he said carefully, that it's highly irregular for a Duke to offer a position to someone of your station. Isla's heart sank. I understand, Your Grace. I can leave quietly. I'm not finished. He crossed the room slowly. I'm told it's irregular. I find I no longer care. She stared at him. You saved my life, he said quietly. Not because you cleaned a wound. Because you saw what no one else bothered to look for. You didn't demand I be stronger. You allowed me to be broken. He paused. I'm told that love often begins exactly that way, with being seen. Isla's breath caught. Your Grace. Caspian, he corrected gently. At least when we're alone. At least for now. The household will talk. Society will, let them. His voice was steady. I spent 13 years building walls because I believed they protected me. But walls don't protect. They just isolate. He reached for her hand carefully, giving her every chance to withdraw. I don't want to be isolated anymore. Isla looked at their joined hands. At this man who had been taught to carry everything alone, who had finally learned the difference between strength and survival. Neither do I, she whispered. The Duke, Caspian, smiled then. Not the careful expression he showed the world, but something genuine and slightly uncertain and entirely real. Then stay, he said. Not as a maid. Not as anything the household recognizes. Just stay. We'll determine the rest together. Together, Isla repeated, tasting the word. If you'll have me. She thought of the music room, of Sans Somme. Into stillness, of a man who had stood in doorways listening because he had forgotten how to ask for comfort directly. She thought of her mother's voice, of lullabies that had carried her through her own grief, of the strange mercy of being present for someone else's breaking. Yes, she said simply. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, steady, the kind that nourishes rather than destroys. Somewhere in the manor, the household continued its routines, unaware that their carefully ordered world had just shifted in ways they would spend months adjusting to. But in the study, two people stood together in comfortable silence, hands joined, walls finally lowered. Not because either was perfectly healed, healing would take far longer, but because they had learned what truly mattered. Not performance, not control, just presence. And sometimes, late at night when old fears returned, when memory pressed too close, a voice would begin singing. A lullaby about sparrows finding their way home, about soldiers returning from darkness, about the steady comfort of being known. And in the listening, in the being seen, they both discovered what they had been missing all along. Not rescue, not fixing, just witness, just grace, just the quiet revolution of two people brave enough to be broken together and whole enough to call it love.